On the night of April 14, 1912, the great ocean liner RMS Titanic sailed through the cold, silent waters of the North Atlantic. Subscribe for more historic stories. On board were more than 2,000 passengers and crew, including hundreds of families, immigrants, wealthy travelers, and among them, many children. Some were infants sleeping peacefully in their mother's arms. Others were young boys and girls exploring the decks of the largest ship ever built. For them, the Titanic was not just a ship. It was an adventure, a journey toward a new life, and a place filled with wonder. But within a few hours, that adventure would turn into one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in history. Children on the Titanic came from many different backgrounds. In first class, wealthy families traveled in luxury suites, where children enjoyed spacious cabins, elegant dining rooms, and even play areas on the ship. They were dressed in fine clothes and accompanied by parents, nurses, and servants. For them, the voyage felt like a floating palace. They walked along the grand decks, listened to music in the lounges, and enjoyed the excitement of crossing the Atlantic on the most famous ship in the world. In second class, children belonged mostly to middle-class families. Their parents were teachers, businessmen, engineers, and professionals, traveling for opportunity or returning home after visits abroad. These children experienced comfort, but also discipline and routine. They ate meals together with their families, attended small social gatherings, and enjoyed the thrill of traveling on a ship that everyone believed was the safest ever built. In third class, the experience was very different. Many children were immigrants traveling with their families to start new lives in America. Their parents had saved money for years to afford the journey. Entire families shared small cabins, and the children spent much of their time exploring the lower decks, making friends with other young passengers who spoke different languages but shared the same excitement. For them, the Titanic represented hope, a chance to escape poverty and build a future across the ocean. Despite these differences in class and wealth, the children aboard the Titanic shared something important: innocence. They did not understand the risks of the sea or the dangers that sometimes followed great ambition and technology. They trusted the adults around them and believed the ship would carry them safely to their destination. Late on the evening of April 14th, most of the children were already asleep in their cabins when the Titanic struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. The collision was not violent enough to wake everyone immediately. Some passengers barely noticed it at all. In many cabins, parents continued preparing their children for bed, unaware that the ship had already begun to slowly fill with water. As the seriousness of the situation became clear, crew members began waking passengers and instructing them to put on life jackets. Parents lifted sleeping children from their beds, wrapping them in blankets and coats against the freezing night air. Many children were confused and frightened. They did not understand why they were suddenly being taken outside into the cold darkness. On the decks, lifeboats were being prepared, but they were not enough for everyone. Officers enforced the rule of women and children first, which meant that many children would have the chance to survive, while their fathers and older brothers were often left behind. For some families, this rule meant painful separations that happened within seconds. Mothers held their children tightly as they were guided toward lifeboats. Some children cried for their fathers, not understanding why they could not come with them. In other cases, fathers reassured their children, telling them everything would be fine, even when they themselves knew the situation was desperate. One of the most emotional scenes occurred when lifeboats began lowering into the dark ocean. Many children were placed into the boats while their fathers stood on the deck above them. Those fathers waved goodbye, hoping their families would survive even if they could not. For many children, that moment was the last time they would ever see their fathers again. While some children were fortunate enough to reach lifeboats early, others were trapped below decks with their families as the ship continued to sink. In third class especially, confusion and language barriers slowed evacuation. Some families struggled to find their way through the corridors toward the upper decks. Every minute mattered, and for many children, those lost minutes determined whether they lived or died. As the ship tilted more sharply, panic spread across the decks. The cold Atlantic wind cut through thin clothing, and the stars above reflected on the dark water below. Children clung to their mothers, while lifeboats were lowered one by one. Some boats left half empty in the early stages because passengers did not yet believe the ship would sink. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, the Titanic finally disappeared beneath the ocean. The freezing water was deadly within minutes. For the children who remained on board, survival was nearly impossible. Those who had reached lifeboats watched the ship vanish into the darkness, surrounded by the cries of hundreds of people in the water. Hours later, the rescue ship, RMS Carpathia, arrived and began collecting survivors from the lifeboats. Among them were many children who had survived the disaster. Some were wrapped in blankets, trembling from cold and shock. Others sat silently, staring across the ocean where the Titanic had once been. For many of these children, survival came with a heavy cost. Some had lost their fathers. Others had lost entire families. A few very young children were rescued without knowing where their parents were. In the days following the disaster, newspapers published photographs of orphaned Titanic children, while authorities searched desperately for relatives who could claim them. The stories of these young survivors became powerful reminders of the human cost of the Titanic disaster. While the world focused on the sinking of a massive ship, the deeper tragedy was the lives forever changed in a single night. Out of the 100-plus children aboard the Titanic, many survived thanks to the evacuation rule that prioritized them. Yet dozens of children still lost their lives, particularly among third-class families, who struggled to reach the lifeboats in time. The Titanic disaster eventually led to major changes in maritime safety laws. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew, and wireless communication had to be monitored at all times. These reforms were meant to ensure that no future tragedy would repeat the same mistakes. More than a century later, the story of the Titanic continues to be remembered around the world. Among all the stories of wealth, luxury, and technological pride, the experiences of the children remain some of the most emotional and unforgettable. They boarded the Titanic as innocent passengers on an exciting journey. Some reached safety and went on to live long lives, carrying the memory of that night forever. Others were lost in the freezing waters of the Atlantic before they had the chance to grow up and see the future their families had dreamed about. The children of the Titanic remind us that behind every historical disaster are human lives and personal stories. Their survival and their loss continue to echo through history, reminding us of the fragile line between hope and tragedy on that cold April night in 1912.